try to go over hadith from the 40th hadith of Imam al-Nawawi. And this week we are at hadith 15, alhamdulillah. We're making some good progress. So without further ado, عن أبي هريرة رضي الله تعالى عنه أن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم قال من كان يؤمن بالله واليوم الآخر فليقل خيرا أو ليصمت ومن كان يؤمن بالله واليوم الآخر فليكرم جاره ومن كان يؤمن بالله واليوم الآخر فليكرم ضيفه رواه البخاري ومسلم. And so it is narrated by Abu Huraira, may Allah be pleased with him, that the Prophet of Allah, the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, said, whoever believes in Allah and in the final day, the day of judgment, he must speak what is good, or remain silent. And whoever believes in Allah on the last day, he must be very generous to his neighbor. He must honor his neighbor. And whoever believes in Allah and the last day must honor his guest. And so there's a lot of beauty in this hadith, because this is getting into deeper into the etiquettes of Islamic etiquettes. And so there's other narrations other people might have heard of that are very similar. There's another narration that says, does not harm the neighbor instead of honors the neighbor. And there's a lot of other hadith that have this kind of formula of whoever believes in Allah in the last day. And we'll touch on some of the other hadith at the end if you have time, inshallah. And so there's a scholar who said that there's really 4 hadith that summarize a lot of the basic etiquettes in Islam. And so this is one of those 4 foundational etiquette principles in Islam. It's these 3 things that we're going to go over, inshallah. There's another hadith that says, and that I think we covered before, is that from the beauty of one's faith is that someone leaves what does not concern him. There's another one, la taghdab, do not become angry. That's another one. And then the 4th one is that none of you truly have completed your faith until you love for your brother what you love for yourself. So those 4, including this one we're going to go over, inshallah, kind of the foundations for etiquette in Islam. One we went over before, the one that leave what doesn't concern you, and 2 will come up in the future, inshallah. And so there's kind of this concept of, in Islam in general, there's this huquq Allah, huquq al-ibad. Huquq is like the rights of someone. So there's like rights that you owe to Allah, and rights that you owe to society, to people around you, to your family, friends, all these people. And so this really falls into huquq al-ibad. And the interesting point is that really it's not such a, there's not really this distinction, because even when you're fulfilling rights to other people, you're really fulfilling rights that you owe to Allah. So there's kind of a lot of overlap. But just generally speaking, this is kind of in the domain of what you need to do for society and to other people around you. And so an interesting point a lot of people ask, scholars have asked for centuries, is why these 2 things? Why is it always whoever believes in Allah and the Day of Judgment? Allah would have been sufficient, whoever believes in Allah, right? Or he could have said just whoever believes in the Day of Judgment. Why is it these 2 things? Why not more? Why not other things are included? And so there's different explanations, there's not one right answer, but some beautiful reflections that scholars have come up with in trying to explain this is that, the first one is that belief in Allah is the foundation. That's where you start. That's really the core of this whole thing. And once you've built that foundation, everything you're building on top of that is going to be judged on the Day of Judgment. And so it's kind of just where you start and then where you end. And another reflection is again, it's the same thing. It's the beginning of the journey and the end of the journey. So the beginning is this belief in Allah, and the end is this accountability with Allah. And then the other reflection is also that it's this balance between hope and fear that we constantly have as Muslims. When you think of Allah, the more you come to understand and learn about Allah, the more Allah is associated with this love and hope and mercy in your heart. So you think of Allah as you have this hope. And then you think of the Day of Judgment, and remember His accountability and His justice. And so it's this kind of balance between having that love and hope from Allah and fear and accountability. So Allahu A'lam, there's a lot of wisdoms that you can derive from this, but those are some interesting reflections. And so going over some of the items, there was 3 points that were brought up. And the first one we'll spend a little more time on, and then there will be other 2, inshallah. So the first one was speak good or remain silent. And that's something that is so much more relevant today, almost it seems like, than it's ever been in the past, subhanAllah. So there's a lot of different hadith that talk about the tongue and the faults of the tongue and the good things you can do with the tongue. There's so many hadith and things that the Sahaba have shared with us. Amongst them is hadith from the Musnad of Imam Ahmad. It comes from Anas ibn Malik, radiallahu ta'ala anhu. Prophet ﷺ said that the person's faith cannot be firm until his heart is straight. And someone's heart cannot be straight until their tongue is straight. And so again, it's kind of like the root. The tongue is the root of a lot of problems, but also a lot of the ability to do good as humans. So it starts with a clean heart, and probably one of the scholars that focus the most on having a pure, clean heart is Imam al-Ghazali. He has a whole like book or chapter, however you want to classify it. It is Ihya al-Din, the revival of the religious sciences. He has a whole thing about diseases of the heart, and then within that he has like this whole thing about destroyer of worlds, what destroys your dunya and your akhirah. And within that he has a whole section on just like the tongue, and he has 20 diseases of the tongue, and we'll go over like 8 of them very briefly. But this is like a whole book that's published in English now, so you can read it, access it if you'd like to. So he goes over like more generally, he goes over this point where there's 7 gates to hell, and there's also 7 limbs that like lead to sin from humans. There's the eyes and the ears and the tongue and the stomach and your private parts and your arms and your legs. These are kind of the 7 major limbs that we use to commit sins, but also do good with them. And so if we protect ourselves from these 7 outlets, we've protected ourselves from basically all sins and all kind of harms that we can do. And so one of them, the major ones, is the tongue. And so the tongue really is created to honor us, and so that we can use it to honor ourselves through dhikr of Allah, remembering Allah, reciting Quran, da'wah, teaching, right? Sharing, interacting as a community, expressing our needs, our emotions. These are all like beautiful aspects that our tongue is there to provide us with. But then there's also this kind of like really scary aspect of our tongues, where the Prophet ﷺ, said that people could end up being thrown into hellfire on their foreheads for nothing other than what their tongue has committed. And there's a hadith from Mu'adh ibn Jabal narrates that very powerfully. And so there's different diseases of the tongues that Imam al-Ghazali shares with us. And I think when we're going over these 8 different ones, I'll just go over them as bullet points to save some time. But just like reflect, like when have you seen this in your own life? Like when do we do it? When do we see our friends do it? When do we do it with our friends or on social media? How do we see it in society? So just kind of try to see like how often this comes up. So lying, a very prominent one. False promises, and that's different than breaking your promise. So it's if you make a promise you intend to break, that's a false promise, as opposed to making a promise and then life happens and you're not able to complete it. That's different. So the false promise is making a promise while you intend not to keep it to begin with. Backbiting, which is also different than slander. So backbiting is when something's true and you say it about someone and they wouldn't want you to say it, and it's something that they wouldn't want to be found out. Slander is when you say something untrue, which is even worse. So backbiting is even if something's true, you should not be saying it about somebody. Debating and argumentation, and again, this is kind of, there's a time and a place for it, but it's very limited and it's much later than most people put it. It's kind of the last thing. It's like the last course of action might end up in debate. Argumentation is never really productive, but it's like really should avoid it when possible, because it's never really changed. It just entrenches people in their own positions, generally speaking. It's not like a good tactic, and it kind of has this thing where it's like you have to be right, and you get closed off to finding the truth. So instead of trying to find the truth, you just try to win, which is very counterproductive. Self-praise is another one of the other diseases. Cursing. Cursing, obviously, like using foul language, but then cursing also like damning things and saying like willing God's damnation on things. That's also another point where a lot of people think that you're allowed to curse, and if you're oppressed, there's a time even in Islam where like you're allowed to curse. If you're an oppressed person, you can curse, but there's no obligation to. And a beautiful point that the Mufti Kamani, where I get these lectures from, he brought up a beautiful point, is that no one will ever in any situation ever be obligated or held accountable for not cursing something. Like even the shaitan, if you never curse the shaitan once in your whole life, it's not going to be a point against you in the day of judgment. But cursing things, the creation of Allah, could be a point brought against you. So even if you think you're in the right, just like don't even go there. Making dua against the creation, and then also excessive mockery or joking, because it can kill the heart. Excessive joking can kill the heart. And mockery can like push people away from the community. It can hurt them, even if we think we're joking. If we do it too much, even in our own friend circles, sometimes it can have some like very hurt feelings and push people away. So these are things that were brought up 900,000 years ago, and they're just as relevant now, if not more so. And every word, another point that was brought up was like every word, every action, but specifically every word that we ever say is written down. We have an angel on our right and an angel on our left, and they write down every little thing that we say, everything that we do, good and bad. And there's a little debate, it's an interesting debate. It's maybe like, it's not really pragmatic, it's not going to change anything with how we should act. But an interesting point is like some people ask, is everything like really written down, or is it just like certain things? So there's like one opinion that says, and this is the opinion of Ibn Abbas, he said that, you know, things that are not sinful or rewarded, so like sneezing, for example, is not going to be like written down. Other people say everything's written down, even if you sneeze or cough. It's a minor point, but it's an interesting conversation. And then there's also, so there's this idea of the book of deeds, and that's all you're going to take with you to your grave and into the hereafter. And a lot of that's going to consist of things that you say. So rather than just saying empty words, try to fill it with good action and good words, inshallah. And Ibn Mas'ud radiallahu anhu said that nothing in this world is more deserving to be locked up than the tongue. And the Prophet ﷺ also said in another hadith, whoever can secure for me what lies between his jaws and his legs, so the tongue and the private parts, I promise him Jannah. And so that's like a very powerful hadith. Ibn Umar radiallahu anhu said that the Prophet ﷺ said, don't speak abundantly without remembering Allah. Indeed, abundance of speech without remembrance hardens the heart, and the one who's furthest from Allah on the Day of Judgment will be the one who's the hardest of heart. So the harder your heart is, the farther away you are from Allah. And there's direct correlation between how you use your tongue and the state of your heart. And this is something that's been coming up a lot in the Hadith and reflections of many scholars and Sahaba. Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, like Abu Bakr, the best Sahaba, the second to none from the Sahaba, said that he would hold his tongue and say like how much trouble this has caused him. And this is Abu Bakr, like someone, you know. So just imagine our state if Abu Bakr is holding his tongue with his hand and saying like, look how much trouble this thing has caused me. And there's also this thing about wisdom and being related to silence. There's a lot of most people who are like wise is like comes from a lot of times knowing when to be silent rather than knowing what to say. And then there's also a lot of positives. So this is kind of the negatives of speech and the dangers related to speech and the tongue. There's also a lot of positives with the tongue. So there's many, but a few like very important ones are remembering Allah, dhikr, reminding other people, even just like saying inshallah, subhanallah, like these things in your conversation, it like enlivens your conversation with the remembrance of Allah. The Quran, something to be recited, something to be reflected on, spent time, like we should spend some time in our day to just read the Quran, asking, seeking knowledge, and also like speaking what concerns you have and things that you need in the dunya also can be all from the beneficial. Speaking with your family is an amazing one. And there's obviously a lot more. And so an interesting point that was also brought up, kind of relating to this idea of how often we use our tongues to talk about other people, is that every time we see a flaw in someone else, we should reflect on how this flaw, like we see it in someone else because we know it, and we know it usually because we've done it ourselves, experienced it ourselves. And so we should reflect on how are these flaws we're seeing in other people, how are they reflected in our lives, and then try to work to fix it like ourselves first. And then they say that if you start doing this as part of your habit, you're going to realize you're going to be too busy to talk about anyone else because you're so busy just working on yourself. Practice restricting your speech. And so kind of just creating this filter where you kind of, before you say it, you're like, all right, is this going to help me in the long term, in the akhirah? Is this going to help me or is this going to hurt me? And even that little simple filter will help a lot, inshallah. And then gatherings, any gathering, and anytime we've spoken really, it's mentioned like anytime you've spoken or sit in a gathering without the remembrance of Allah, will be a source of regret for us on the Day of Judgment. The Day of Judgment has many names, and one of them is the Day of Regret. And even if you end up in Jannah, you're going to regret not having done more, especially in situations where you don't remember Allah. So like, if we're in a gathering, make sure that we bring up the remembrance of Allah, inshallah. And then knowing that staying silent is not worship in itself. So staying silent is not, like it's positive when it's preventing harm, but it's not always a good thing. There's times where you need to speak up. So if you know something, you need to speak up because you know it. If you see something that's injustice, you need to speak up against injustice. And we know like how powerful and how many examples there are in the Prophet's life. And so silence is not always the best option. It's just better than saying something bad. So just keeping that in mind. And then the next point, and we'll try to go over these a little quicker. But the next point was our neighbors. And there's so many powerful hadith about our neighbors. Ibn Mas'ud, radiallahu anhu, he said, what is the greatest sin? He asked the Prophet what is the greatest sin? The Prophet said the first one was to add a partner to Allah, even though He is the one who created you. The second is to kill your child out of fear of poverty. And then the third one was to commit adultery with a neighbor. And this goes to the idea of like the neighbors, like you should have this bond of trust like between you two. And if you break that trust, it's amongst the greatest sins. And there's another one that says that Prophet ﷺ was sitting there and he was saying like, swearing by Allah that they're not a believer. He's like, I swear by Allah he's not a believer, by Allah he's not a believer, by Allah he's not a believer. And so the Sahaba asked, like, who is it that you're talking about? And he says, the one whose neighbor is not safe from him is not a believer. And so this is like a very powerful point, that the neighbor should never feel danger or unsafe around you, or oh, what's he going to do next, or she's going to do next. It should be something that we always keep in mind, to have good relations with our neighbors. The Prophet ﷺ said that Jibreel would come to him so often to remind him of the rights of the neighbor, that he thought that they were almost going to inherit, that they were going to be part of the family to inherit from them. That's how close the neighbor should be. And how do we define neighbor? The Prophet ﷺ even taught us that, subhanAllah. He said that the neighbor is like 40 houses, basically in each direction, like in a circumference, radius of 40 houses around us, is considered neighbor. And so like an example is Aisha radiallahu anha, she asked, if I have one gift and I can't offer it to two neighbors, who should I prefer? And then he said the closer one. So it's kind of like this radius of 40 houses, all considered our neighborhood, our neighbors. But the ones closest to us, we should try to offer service and food and comfort to first and foremost. And then as we get better at it, try to expand out now, inshallah. And then, I'm trying to go down here. And the Prophet ﷺ said, like, an example is a lot of people ask, is this true for non-Muslim neighbors too? Like, is it only for Muslim neighbors or non-Muslim neighbors? And there's many examples, and one very prominent one, the Prophet ﷺ said, one time they slaughtered an animal for meat, and they wanted to distribute it. And so the Prophet ﷺ came 3 times specifically, at least 3 times, it might have been more, but at least 3 times he came and asked, did you give it to my Jewish neighbor? Like, did you give it to my Jewish neighbor? He had a neighbor, and the neighbor was Jewish, and he made sure that no one forgot to give it to this person just because they weren't Muslim or something. He wanted to ensure that the rights of all his neighbors were ensured, including his Jewish neighbor, which is very beautiful. And then from amongst the rights of the neighbor upon you is that if they seek debt, give it. If they seek, this is from the Hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. He said, if they seek debt, give it to them. If they seek assistance, give it to them. If they're sick, visit them and help them. If they're in need, provide for them. When something good happens to them, give them glad tidings. If something bad happens to them, give them condolences. If they die, follow their funeral. If don't build something that's going to block the wind from them. So don't build something in your property that's going to obstruct something in their property without asking for their permission. Don't harm them with the smell of your pot, which is very interesting. One is that you shouldn't be like a nuisance making very smelly things that's going to annoy them. And then also, if they're hungry, don't forget to feed them. And if you buy fruit, make sure you give it to them. And if you can't, try to keep it secret so they don't feel bad. And then the last one is honoring your guests. There's a lot of overlap with honoring your neighbor, but there's also some special things for the guests. Some people even said that taking care of a guest for one night is wajib, it's mandatory. That's kind of a minority opinion. Most people say the majority opinion is that it's not wajib, but it's from etiquette, it's from basic etiquette, and something we should all practice. So this idea of there's a minimum of one night where you should go above and beyond to help somebody, and if they need to stay longer, the next 2 or 3 nights, treat them as if they were your family. And when they leave, make sure that you give them provision for a day and a night. Some people say it depends on who the guest is. If it's your family, you must help them. If it's an enemy, you probably don't have to. Some people say it depends where you are. If it's in a city, there's other accommodations that they can seek, so it's not like a wajib. Whereas if you're in a nomadic area, rural area, you might be the only person, and it's a life or death situation, so you need to take care of them. But the idea again is that there's responsibility on both sides, of the guest and the host. And we'll end with this, inshallah. The guests, the rights of the guest upon the host. The host must make the guest feel comfortable. You must be generous, be clean. Don't go above and beyond so that you make yourself uncomfortable, you don't want to ever host someone ever again. Keep it within reasonable limits. But the idea is just to be generous, treat them like family or even better than family. Be clean, give them rest, give them dress, have good etiquette, dress up well. From the guest side, it's to be aware of your burden that you're being on the family. Make sure that they have privacy, so if they invite you past the guest house, the guest room, make sure you don't pry and see what they have and judge them for it. And you don't know what obligations they have, so make sure you don't overstay your visit and you leave soon. So inshallah we can learn from some of these etiquettes. And I apologize if I went over time today, but there was just a lot to share. Jazakallah khair for your attention.